do good.
Sure.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out today in the rain. And for those of you who like snow, if it was a colder, you'd be happy. But for the rest of us, good. It's just rain. Anyway, my name is Paul Eisenhower. I'm a member of the Center for Lifelong Learning at Leisure World, and we'll be hosting today's presentation on hate crimes. Real quick, I'm also the leader of the Diversity Relations Council at Leisure World, and we applaud any time or any instance, event that will bring awareness to any part of or aspect of diversity. Now, I'm going to introduce our speaker, but you'll have to excuse me for reading because his background's a bit of a mouthful for me. And our Steve Klein is who's going to be speaking. He's a resident here at Leisure World, and he's also the Government Affairs Advisory Committee Chairman here. Okay, let's see. He has a professional background, including 7 years, both as an assistant district attorney and later as assistant attorney general for the state of New York, and time as assistant commissioner in charge of the citywide inspector general program at New York City, the New York City Department of Investigations, and senior counsel for the New York State Senate Committee on Investigations and Government Operations. He spent 5 years as an administrative law judge for the New York City Department of Education, hearing cases involving student suspensions. Then spent 15 years as an adjunct associate professor of law and police science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. And then for 7 years, he had a private practice in criminal and administrative law, including guardianships. So anyhow, Steve, it's all yours. We'll be happy to hear from you.
Paul, I'm glad you introduced me because now I can give a shout out to you. You may or may not know it, but Paul heads a group here in Leisure World dealing with enhancing the abilities of people with disabilities of any kind to fully enjoy the life here at Leisure World. So Paul, I probably missed some parts of that, but I'm very proud to have you as a friend, and I'm delighted in the things that you do, because people with disabilities are also victimized by hate crimes. So let's start. What are hate crimes? What are hate crimes? What are hate acts? And why is it so important for us, whether you're here today or not? We live in Leisure World. And I checked as of about a week ago to see if there were any instances of hate acts or crimes committed with the victims being residents of Leisure World. Thank goodness there are none. I'm sure there are people who have arguments, neighbors who have arguments. They may use some words that are not pleasant. But we do not have, fortunately, anybody in Leisure World that I'm aware of who's been victimized by a hate crime within the four corners of Leisure World. So why is it important for all of us to know about hate crimes? First and foremost, when a hate crime is committed, and I'll be defining that in a minute, it has a horrible effect on the community where the hate crime was committed. It causes a lot of hatred, people are frightened, it eats at the community's well-being. So knowing about hate crimes is very, very important so that we can find ways to lessen the effects of hate crimes and even to diminish, if not eradicate, hate crimes in our community. So what is a hate crime? Person or people commit a criminal act against a person who has a background, could be gender identity, people that we call today lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, cis-sex, gender. Hate crimes committed against people of color, race, creed, nationality, anywhere. And if you look at the 3 pages at the end of my outline, one of the pages has 3 boxes to show you how the Justice Department defines a hate crime. And what they're doing is they're in essence saying an underlying crime, and the key to a hate crime is motivation. What's the motivation, real or perceived, for a person to commit a crime against an individual or a group of other people? And so a hate crime really has 2 parts, but the key part to making something a hate crime is when the prosecutors or whoever's investigating, police departments, in Maryland, a lot of it would be through our, let's say, our Montgomery County Attorney's Office. And that office under John Murphy is made up of 90 assistants, and they're all the equivalents of assistant DAs. And John Murphy, who I've had the privilege of hearing and speaking with one-on-one, is really like the district attorney. And I admire him because he tries cases at his high level. Doesn't leave it to his staff. He tries his own share of cases. So we know that a hate crime is a criminal act committed against an individual, it's committed against a group, and it could also be committed against the property or properties of people who are the victims. We have a bunch of civil rights laws that have been in effect for many years. One of those laws deals with committing acts of vandalism, arson, etc., against houses of worship. And in the state of Maryland, our state, I checked the penal law, though I don't practice law anymore. I still can read criminal law. And they prosecute somebody or a group that will commit an act of arson, even greater than vandalism, against a building or a store, anything owned by the so-called victim. But again, you always have to prove that the reason for the committing of the underlying crime was the real or perceived, even if they're wrong in thinking the person is one of the protected groups, it's the committing of a crime against them because of their fitting into these various categories in the law. At the end of my talk, I have an attribution section in which I tell you that much of what I'm talking about to you today comes from the U.S. Department of Justice, particularly the Civil Rights Division, the State Attorney General, who has been doing a lot of work on hate crimes, the County Attorney, and one group that I've been identified with for probably 4 decades, and that's the Anti-Defamation League of what we call B'nai B'rith. The ADL actually started with the lynching in 1915 of a Jewish supervisor who was a mechanical engineer in a factory in Georgia. He was convicted of murdering a young lady working in the store. I think she was even maybe a child, 12, 13 years old, whatever. And I think his sentence was commuted to life in jail. And by the way, the evidence against him was very shoddy. But that didn't satisfy a group of people who went to the jail where he was locked up and they overran the jail. They took him out, and they lynched him. And this place where it took place was Marietta, Georgia, 1915. This formed the beginning of the Anti-Defamation League. Now, even though they sound Jewish and much of their focus is dealing with anti-Semitism, anti-Israel, etc., they are a group that believes, as I do, that a hate crime committed against anyone is a hate crime committed against all of us. So we have people here, I'm glad to see, of Asian, Pacific Island background. The number of hate crimes against people from Asia in the United States has gone up, I heard this week, almost 300%. And so a bill was passed in Congress, believe it or not, to actually pass something called the Coronavirus Hate Act, because who are the people that are accused more than anybody of bringing in the coronavirus to the States? People of Asian background. Nonsense. But it sticks with a lot of people. Also, President Biden signed an executive order providing money and additional assistant attorney generals in the U.S. Department of Justice to specialize in dealing with hate crimes committed against our Asian friends. I say Pacific Island because the two seem to go together. Let me give you a short history in the Supreme Court. And by the way, the Supreme Court hasn't been a great friend of people who are victims of hate crimes. So we start out with a case in the early 1990s in St. Paul, the twin city to Minneapolis. A white youth takes a chair apart and he puts the chair together in the form of a cross and he burns it. He burns it on the law of an African American family. He's charged with a series of crimes, including the Minnesota hate crime law. And lo and behold, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. You know what happened? Supreme Court threw out his conviction. They said that law imposed and was treading on his First Amendment rights. That decision caused so much consternation and head scratching that within a year or so, the next case to reach the Supreme Court was a case that involved, it was a case in, Wisconsin, that involved an African American youth with his friends standing on a street who had just seen a movie in which an African American little boy was beaten seriously by an adult, and the little African American boy was doing nothing but praying in the movie. Well, this incensed the young man named Mitchell, and along across the street comes our victim, a little white boy, doing nothing, bothering nobody, and Mitchell says, "Go get him and F him up." And so they do. And this little white boy is in a coma for 3 days. 3 days. Case goes up to the Supreme Court, and finally the Supreme Court looks at it and says, freedom of speech doesn't protect hate acts and hate crimes. And so that was literally the first Supreme Court case that got it right. Your conduct is what should be prosecuted, not your speech per se. All right? And who was it that actually came up with the idea of punishing the crime the person commits as opposed to their speech? ADL, Anti-Defamation League. And then who was it that came up with the idea of tracking these hate crimes across the country? The Anti-Defamation League. So we had a federal law dealing with a requirement that the FBI pick up and keep statistics on hate crimes in the various states. So why is that valuable? Well, you have some idea of where your biggest problems are in the country, which states, which cities, which counties, etc. But there's always been a fault in hate crime statistics. They always seem to be underreported. And why do you think they're underreported? One reason is lots of people are ashamed and embarrassed to come forward and to admit that they've been victimized by a person or a group of people. The other thing is, many police departments didn't always take hate crime reporting as seriously as they should have. Many did, some did not. So in the last 6 months or so, I saw a webinar online by the FBI indicating that they were undertaking to do better training of police departments around the country so that they can actually recognize incidents as being hate crimes. So that's been a big step in the right direction, and ADL's been keeping its own statistics, and up until this year, I think ADL's numbers were always greater than the FBI's. So that's a problem. I also said at the beginning, what's the difference between a hate crime and a hate act? Two people are in a parking lot and they're fighting over a parking space. One is African American, one is white. They call it, the white person calls the African American the N-word, the African American calls him the honky and what other names, and they're cursing and screaming at each other, but nobody is physically assaulting the other, and that more than likely would be known as a hate act. Is it pleasant? Of course not. Does it cause consternation among somebody maybe on the receiving end of those words? Absolutely. And in some cases, depending on the facts and the circumstances, even those words can sometimes be prosecuted as hate crimes. So I wanted to just take a minute. If you look at the back in color, I have a page of statistics from the FBI. And what the page shows you is that you've got this circle bar graph, and it gives you sexual orientation, hate crimes committed in 2020, a 20.5% increase. Hate crimes against people of different religious backgrounds, and that includes Jews, Christians, Muslims, whatever. 13.4%. Racial ethnicity and ancestry, that includes people who are African American, have the highest degree of hate crimes committed against them because of the color of their skin. 61.9. Sexual orientation, I just mentioned. And hate crime incidents keep going up. They don't go down, they keep going up. The victims of hate crimes in 2020 involved 2,528 victims, and single bias incidents involved 7,554. So the website to pick this all up is on that page that I gave you. And if you want to look into it a little bit further, you can. And I also looked into the state of Maryland. What's happening with us with hate crimes? And the statistics that I come up with from the state of Maryland indicate that our hate crime acts are in the hundreds, not thousands. But they're also going up in the state of Maryland as well. So, now we've talked a little bit about history of hate crimes. And by the way, before the hate crimes, you had federal laws, federal civil rights laws, the most famous of which was the 1965 Civil Rights Act. Why was that so important? Let's go back in our history books. Any history teachers here to correct me if I make a mistake? Okay. Right after the Civil War, we had federal troops from the North in the South. And as long as they were in the southern states, people of color had a chance to vote, and people of color were elected to all kinds of offices, including Congress. But sometime in 1870 or thereafter, the northern troops leave under some agreement between somebody named Tilden, who ran for president, and I forget who the other person was. But once the federal troops were left, the beginning of what we call Jim Crow laws crept up in the South. The Ku Klux Klan came into being. One of the reasons was to keep people of color in their place, or frighten them from even trying to vote. So all of these things were going on, and Congress was trying to pass different types of legislation, but what did we wind up with before the Civil Rights Act in the 20th century? Poll taxes for people of color, not necessarily people who were Caucasian. We wound up with literacy tests, and everything under the sun was done to keep African Americans and other minorities, and by the way, I'm including native-born people, American Indians, are also, and were also subject to great discrimination in voting. So we have the March on Selma, Alabama. I believe it's in 1965. Martin Luther King crosses the Penn Bridge, and people are beaten to a pulp, including John Lewis, who just passed away. One of the people who marched with Martin Luther King was a rabbi who was also a survivor of the Holocaust, and Dr. King called him his personal rabbi. That's Abraham Joshua Heschel. Anybody ever hear of him? I would hope so. Heschel was a great friend of the Civil Rights Movement. So he risked his life and he marched. At that point, I think President Johnson, as president, he decides, you know what, enough of this. And even though John F. Kennedy, before his assassination, tried to get a civil rights voting law passed, Lyndon Johnson, with all his contacts and his history in the Congress over the years, and he wasn't above pushing, shoving, or whatever he had to do to get it done, they created the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And what were some of the key points of that Voting Rights Act? Well, one of the points of the Voting Rights Act was to set up an inspection system by the Department of Justice and the U.S. federal courts. That meant that any southern state that wanted to make changes in their voting laws had to be approved that they were fair and reasonable to all the people in their state. And this was a big hammer against some of the Jim Crow laws that had passed. They also tried to get rid of the poll taxes, the literacy tests, and everything else. So it was a law that did a great deal to try to eradicate the acts that were done to do what? To basically ignore what was passed after the Civil War. What's that? The 15th Amendment. It says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Well, the South didn't read that very much, or they ignored it. But the Civil Rights Act tried to put back the 15th Amendment where it belonged. And it succeeded. It succeeded until a number of years ago, our great Supreme Court eradicated both parts of the Civil Rights Act of 1965, a case called U.S. versus Shelby in 1913, and then a case just this summer in Arizona, I think it was U.S. versus Brnovich, and I think Brnovich was the Attorney General of the state of Arizona. who I believe should be ashamed of what he did, they threw out all of these sections of the 1965 law. The Supreme Court, not the South, not the bigots, the Supreme Court, the majority conservative members of the Supreme Court threw it out. So what did Congress try to do? Well, this last year, with the vice president being the tiebreaker, you for once had a majority in the Senate. The House voted on two acts, one of which was the John Lewis Act to bring back all the portions of the Civil Rights Act, and there was a second act. So the House voted on it, but what happened in the last 2 weeks? Anybody remember what happened when they tried to vote on the John Lewis Act? Did the members of the Democratic Party in the Senate hold together? Absolutely not. They claimed, and to me, I'm not going to get into a discussion on the filibuster, but they used that as their reason to them, and this John Lewis law didn't go anywhere. Fortunately, the Attorney General of the state of Maryland and 17 other Attorney Generals have recently brought a lawsuit against that wonderful governor of the state of Florida, who's not responsible for anything. All the people who died, who were sick of COVID, all the other things. And without any proof that the 2020 elections were rigged or hurt, no proof except on the part of a former president, no one, there was no proof, but he instituted, as well as a whole bunch of other states, actions which they deemed to eliminate fraud in voting. So they eliminated the idea of absentee ballots, the idea of having a holiday, national holiday for voting, a bunch of things which serve not to eliminate fraud because nobody proved it was there, and there was 62 plus lawsuits taken out against the various states that voted for President Biden to prove what? Fraud and abuse? Nothing. Nothing was proven. Maybe it's being done because of a fear that our minority people in the United States will soon be the majority and they want to protect their rights. That is something being floated around on a regular basis. So we have some lawsuits. I have no great confidence in the Supreme Court upholding this, but maybe the good Lord will intervene and talk some sense into them. What are they worried about? They're worried about losing power. And isn't that much different than they were with the Jim Crow laws in these states? Okay? So, we've talked about statistics. We know they're going up. We know a lot of efforts are being made to deal with them. Let me talk about a couple of not nice things, but good things in the right direction that have been happening recently, and it's all within the last couple of months. In Charlottesville, Virginia, 2017, in August, a group of white supremacists protested what? The taking down of the Robert E. Lee statue, and there were acts of violence when I believe it was 19 people were hurt and one woman was hit by a car of one of the white supremacists, as well as a bunch of other people. That case went to court, federal court, and there was a $26 million verdict in Charlottesville, Virginia, against these white supremacists. And I hope they are able to collect every penny. I can also mention to you that there were a group of people in a synagogue that Saturday in Charlottesville who were terrorized by a group of these white supremacists who stood in front of the temple. They were terrorized to go out their front door. And then at night, what did we see on the news and everywhere else? These clean-looking white supremacists going, and Jews will not replace us. To which President Trump said, well, there were nice people on both sides. It's beyond my recognition of that. The death of George Floyd, Minneapolis, at the hands of the police. Well, you had the recent conviction of Derek Chauvin, who had his foot on the neck of George Floyd for over 9 minutes, despite George Floyd begging for him to take his knee off his neck, because this actually caused the death of George Floyd. And I think there were 3 other police officers, one of whom was supposed to be going to trial this week, and the other 2 sometime later on. They did nothing, not a damn thing, to grab Chauvin and say, that's enough. Nothing. And I hope they're convicted and get the book thrown at them. And I hope it's a lesson where police officers exceed their authority, that they will be prosecuted and prosecuted to the hilt. Now, I'm a former assistant district attorney. I worked with police officers for a good part of my career. And almost everybody I worked with was a shining star as far as I'm concerned. But yes, we have some terrible things going on, and that has to change. What about this week? What happened this week? 3 men accused of shooting Ahmaud Arbery, and if I mispronounce the name correctly, because that's the best pronunciation I have. Who is Ahmaud Arbery? He was jogging in a neighborhood in Georgia, and the 3 men go after him, and one of them shoots him to death. Well, guess what happened? They're all convicted. They all got life sentences. To me, that's not enough punishment. I wish there was something else. But then, the Justice Department tried to reach a deal with 2 of the defendants that if they admitted what they did, they would forego a hate crimes trial in federal court. So you see, the underlying crime was the murder. The hate crime would be the reason why they picked on him. And what was their defense? Well, we heard that there were break-ins and burglaries in the community. So, what does that have to do with this guy? Because he's black? And basically, the family of our friend, Mr. Arbery, God bless him, may he rest in peace, the community, the parents and the attorneys said, we want them to serve in Georgia prisons. Why? They're lousy prisons. They're tough places. What the U.S. Attorney was going to do was give 2 of them, or probably all 3 of them, a shot at being in a federal prison, which is a lot more known for some civility, if you will. At least they have a better chance of surviving in a federal lockup than they do in the state of Georgia. So, that's a good thing. Recent federal conviction of a man charged with threatening to kill and to torture Jewish journalists. And that was a U.S. Department of Justice conviction. And you may or may not remember, but a number of years ago, we gave a talk about Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt is the person that President Biden has named to be his overseer for incidents of anti-Semitism. And she can't get through the Republican Senate because they don't like some of her texts or emails. And she wrote a book a few years ago about the horrors of not only anti-Semitism, but the horrors of all kinds of hate. And there was an author as well, who, by the name of, let me find him, was an author who was a bureau chief at the New York Times, who was not physically assaulted, but groups of hate mongers use what they call doxing, D-O-X-I-N-G, and all kinds of things to anonymously hide their true identities while they were calling him and threatening him with every kind of violence that you could imagine. So the conviction of this one guy recently by the U.S. Department of Justice, of course, is a step in the right direction. Now, if you look on my outline, behind my outline is a picture of two deputy sheriffs holding a chain. Does everybody see that? The two deputy sheriffs were at the trial of the killers of Matthew Shepard. And Matthew Shepard, on a cold October evening in 2009, was tied to a fence, beaten beyond recognition, and left to die. They found him, I think, in less than a day, and he survived in the hospital for a couple of days, and then he passed away. Matthew Shepard's ashes are at the National Cathedral today, and that's a place I like to give tours on, and it's a place I feel very much at home at. I see so many windows dealing with the Old Testament, I feel like I'm among friends. But he is buried there. And you know, the court was considering the death sentence for him, but the parents of Matthew Shepard didn't want them to be executed. Sorry they took that position, but that's what they did. What about James Byrd Jr.? He was an African-American man who one night in June of 2009, I think it's 2009, was offered a ride by two men in a truck to where he lived, and making the biggest mistake of his life, he thanked them and agreed to accept the ride. He thanked them very much for what they were doing for him. But on some point out of town, the two white men got out of the cab, out of the truck, and they grabbed James Byrd Jr., and they tied his ankles to the back of the truck so that his head was hanging perilously close to the road. In fact, it was on the road. And after driving some distance, he actually was beheaded by his I think there were three of them, by the three captors. And of course they argued their First Amendment rights were abridged, and everybody said, you gotta be kidding. And two of the three of them got the death sentence and were executed. All right? I know that people hate the death penalty. I've taught for and against the death penalty, but a killing like this, I don't want to pay for somebody being in jail for this horrendous crime. So as we go on to Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, Congress created the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. What did they add that wasn't there before? Well, it was the time of killing James Byrd, and that was, we can't say that was sexual, that was a racial thing. But Matthew Shepard certainly was, he was picked on because he was gay. They were not hate crimes at the time. And so these two crimes shocked the Congress to such an extent that they added illegal conduct taken against the victim because of the victim's, sexual orientation, gender identity, as the bias attached to the underlying crime against the victim or victims. So as an example, it added violent conduct against people identifying themselves with one or more of the terms used under the umbrella LGBTQ: lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, and queer. If you ask me to explain them, I might have some difficulty, although I've tried very hard to understand what they are. But more important is to accept people as people, in my opinion. I can't tell you what to do, but I believe that they should be accepted as who they are. So we now talk, and we also just talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, designed to eradicate all the Jim Crow laws that has been decimated, eradicated, I can't even think of other words, by the Supreme Court. And recently was the anniversary of the death of somebody by the name of John Plessy. John Plessy may not mean a lot to you unless you've studied the Constitution and constitutional law. In a case in the 1890s, there was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And what did the Supreme Court come out and do? The Supreme Court said, separate but equal is all that is necessary for people of color and other minorities, that they have an equal education. And that's nonsense. It never was. So it took up till, 1954, Thurgood Marshall, one of the great justices of his time, and others, he took the case of Brown versus Board of Education. And they used a professor at City College, my alma mater, undergraduate, who gave many examples. He gave what they call a Brandeis brief. Louis Brandeis was the first Jew elected to the Supreme Court. And the way he used to argue cases before he was on the Supreme Court was to do a sociological and statistical analysis against the people he was appearing against. So this professor at the City College did the same thing, and he showed time after time that children of color, being separated, playing only with dolls of their color, etc., were terribly discriminated against and lost an opportunity to learn among everybody. And the white kids were also denied. What were they denied? They were denied the right to get to know other children of a different background and a different means. And so, being kids, to play together, to do things together. So those are what kinds of things transpired. But Brown versus Board of Ed was the first case to say separate but equal was unconstitutional. And what do you think happened in some of our southern states? They closed their school systems down rather than integrate, didn't they? And so what happened was that after a number of years, these schools had to integrate. And of course today we have what we call de facto segregation. It's been around for decades, in which people who can move out of a particular area may move out of a particular area, making the area segregated again. But that's a subject in and of itself, and that includes people of all colors. People who are African American may want to move to a better neighborhood because there have been more opportunities. So de facto segregation is something that we deal with. So I think that basically covers most of the subjects that I wanted to do. I wanted to do it in about 45 minutes, which I have. And I'll be very happy to take some questions, assuming I'm smart enough to answer them. I may not be, but I'll try. So, anybody have any questions? There's a mic that you can have. Oh, you'll take them around? Okay. This gentleman wants to speak. Thank you, sir. Oh, you want to take the mic around? That's great. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Timmons, identify yourself.
Mr. Timmons.
Okay, good.
Thanks, Steve. Steve, a couple of questions.
Sure.
Is the fact that a crime is labeled a hate crime, is the punishment different?
Yes. If the person is convicted of a hate crime, generally it's a penalty enhancement statute. Thank you for reminding me. It means that you're not only being punished for the underlying crime, but the hate crime adds additional punishment. And that's what they hope to be as a deterrent, if you will, to people committing hate crimes.
Okay, let me follow, I have another question.
Sure.
Follow up that. Does that mean, for example, the example you gave between a federal civil crime and what's the word I'm looking for?
Criminal.
crime.
Yeah.
In other words, there's a penalty for a criminal crime that's enhanced with the civil crime if it's a hate crime. Is that what you're saying?
Well, you know, it's interesting, you should also mention that. Thank you. I didn't even pay him to ask these questions, and we're close friends. Our state senator, by the name of Ben Kramer, Senator Kramer, has a bill right now on hate crimes in the state of Maryland to allow people who are victimized of hate crimes to bring a civil suit against the perpetrator. Civil suit, it would need to get, more penalties. Look at the way civil and criminal cases are handled, okay? It's been a long time since I tried a case. My grandchildren aren't even old enough, but take the case of, who was the great football player who allegedly killed his girlfriend, and our white fellow that was tried in...
O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson.
O.J. Simpson, thank you, Frank. I keep him around too. O.J. Simpson was tried and acquitted in California courts. There've been 100,000 movies on it and everything else. Then he was tried civilly. The burden of proof in a criminal case, Al, is you got to prove each and every element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. In a civil case, it may be 51% by majority or a higher majority, but certainly not beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's easier. And just as an anecdote, I was teaching at John Jay College, and O.J. Simpson was being tried civilly, and one of my students who looked like the refrigerator from Chicago, Bears, got up and he looked at me and he said, "Professor Klein, what do you think about the civil case against O.J. Simpson?" I looked at him and I said, "I don't know, Ahmed, what do you think?" Everybody broke up. I said, "Seriously, thank you for asking that question." Then I showed them the cases against the girlfriend for sexual abuse and things like that. So I broke the ice, so to speak, with them.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
how do you define a hate crime? I mean, the various categories. What happens if, say, a black gay person or something, is that considered a racial crime or a
It might be
sexual crime?
both. Might be considered both.
Well, how about the statistics you showed us? Are these multiple?
These are statistics.
Would the same incident, I guess what I'm asking you, would a single incident be counted more than once?
Right. Each one could be a hate crime, Al. Each one. Yes, ma'am in the back. Thank you. I'll pay you at...
Hi, Steve. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome.
In 2021, there were 375 transgender people murdered in the United States, and that was only captured. I doubt very much that the volume was too much higher. But the problem is not so much that we have to have laws against everything in this country. We need to get back to a moral level for people and the behavior that they are exhibiting. It's not all right to make fun of people who are disabled when the president of the country mimics and degrades journalists because of a physical disability, that putting people behind him with t-shirts that says, "I'm a cop supporter," and then his people are attacking the Capitol and beating the police with American flags, Confederate flags, Trump flags.
Absolutely.
The behavior is what the problem is, and consistently passing laws doesn't
do it.
solve the root of the problem. I don't know what it is that would do that, but
Tell me your first name.
Pat.
Pat, thank you, Pat. I had one sheet here that I forgot to talk about, but this is the Maryland Office of the Attorney General. And they have a civil rights division. And the U.S. Department of Justice has a civil rights division. And the Anti-Defamation League, obviously, deals a lot in civil rights. And they put out a piece of paper, I'm sorry I didn't add it, a comprehensive response to hate crimes involves the engagement of local government, law enforcement, prosecutors, schools, religious institutions, residents, and civil rights and community-based organizations. Strategies stakeholders can implement to combat hate crime activity, and this is what they suggest. Maybe this is also a waste of time, I hope it's not. Publicly condemn suspected hate crime activity. Let the community come out and say, we don't support this horror. We don't support this person. Establish a network of community stakeholders to ensure prompt responses against the hate mongerer and to help the victim who needs so much help. Could be psychological help, could be anything. Encourage victims and witnesses to report hate crimes to law enforcement. And if the cops aren't taking your complaint, complain to the ADL, complain to the Attorney General. They will take the case, I promise you that. Employ restorative justice practices where appropriate. Promote activities that embrace diverse populations and unite communities. Advocate for laws and policies that enhance the state's responses to hate crimes. That's not what you're talking about, because that's just another law. But I think, why don't we give it a try? Why don't we try to get people in communities to talk to each other? I didn't define transgender because I don't feel comfortable that I know enough to define it, but you correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it means somebody who was born to one sex, physically and mentally desires to change that sex, and will take various options to do that. Am I correct? Is there anything I'm leaving out? I just want to make sure I understand.
I think it's more than a desire, it's really a wiring or a hormonal. You're born in the body, but internally, you're of a different sex.
Yes.
The other sex.
Yes.
That's
So it's a
more than just
physical and a
desire.
mental.
Yes,
Okay, good.
as I understand it.
Thank you, Ann. Anybody else have any questions?
I do.
Yes, Ann.
I'll take advantage of having the mic.
No, the heck with you. No. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I have two questions, actually.
Uh-huh.
Would whoever is, if they find whoever is calling in these bomb threats to the HBCUs, and
Good, I'm glad you asked.
is that a hate crime? And also, would you care to comment on what social media, how that seems to be driving these hate crimes?
Yes, yes. All right, first and foremost, in order for there to be a hate crime, you got to have somebody committed it. Do we know who's making those calls? Do we have a shot at finding that out? And who is the crime against? It's against all the students in those universities. It happen to be African American, black colleges. So would I consider it a hate crime? Absolutely. We got to find the person who committed it. Okay? And your second question is, I totally agree, and I like to stay as far away from, even though I'm a tour guide and I have people touch base with me, I like to stay away from Facebook, and I don't think I've ever used, what's the dictating,
Twitter?
Twitter. I've,
And just various others. They
yeah,
seem to be
well,
springing up every
you see that they took the president off of it, the former president, God help us. They took him off of those things. But yes, they do not stop enough of this craziness, and they should be held entirely accountable. And how do you hold these people accountable? Through their wallet, through their bank accounts. You can have all the laws in the world, but unless you hit them where it hurts. And these people are making billions of dollars every quarter, so what do they care? You know, and by the way, so does not Apple, but the other group. What's that?
Amazon?
Amazon. I haven't seen that. What's the other group that The people who don't have Apple phones have their phones.
Samsung?
Well, Samsung is the company, but what's the
Oh,
operating
Microsoft.
system? What's it? Android.
Android.
I mean, all of these people are horrendous purveyors of allowing hate to exist on the internet. And I couldn't agree with you more. But I think the way to beat them is not to have a law that says if you do this, you're in trouble. It's to sue them where you can show some harm and hit them where it hurts in the pocketbook. That's what I believe in. It may be naive, but that's what I look at. Ann, you have anything else you want to ask?
Any final questions? Any from that side? No, then I'll just say for everyone here, thank you very much for a very informative presentation.
I appreciate you guys in the CLL giving me an opportunity to speak.
And we hope you'll come back and give us an update maybe next year before
Well,
it's happening.
And then I think the next time, if I do get to speak, I will bring people in from the various prosecuting offices around the state, and I would love to have a panel
Well, that would
discussion.
be fun.
Okay?
That would be
Thank
great.
you for allowing me to speak, and thank you
Thank
all for
you.
attending.